Right, so Iran has just captured a US oil tanker, and if you listen to Western media, you'd think Iran did this to deliberately escalate tensions in the region, and, well, there might be an element of that, of course, but the trouble with that reasoning is that Iran have done this under the jurisdiction of a court order. So the capture of this vessel is completely legal. Now, the US might complain and kick off and find fault over this. They may choose to not recognise the order that allowed the Iranian Navy to take this vessel into custody. But given the stunt they pulled last year with this same vessel, they might not want to complain too loudly. Right, so this story made me smile in a wry kind of a way, because if there's anything that will get America wailing quickly and loudly, it's taking oil away from them. The Middle East is oil rich. So much of what we're seeing today happening out there, Gaza and Israel, even that reputedly has its links to oil. A large oil field off the Gazan coast that they are prevented from accessing, the Gazan people themselves. But this story, from just over a week ago now, has flown largely under the radar, which when you consider it involves oil, is a little bit surprising. So what's the story then, Damo? Well, this is a story of a court order, certainly, oil, definitely, theft, definitively, and some revenge mixed with a bit of Middle Eastern intervention following US and UK attacks on those Iranian-backed Houthis in Yemen, quite possibly. The ship in question, an oil tanker that was en route to Turkey, is the Marshall Islands registered St. Nicholas, and it's captured by Iran on January 11th amidst attacks on the Houthis in Yemen, coinciding with those bombing attacks by the US and UK last week, has led to accusations of this being Iran sticking its beak in where it shouldn't be. But there's more to it than that. You see, last year, this same ship, though under a different name, called the Suez Rajan as it was at that point, was captured by the US under an alleged sanctions enforcement operation. However, what the US did was take the tanker back to Texas, offload the 800,000 barrels of Iranian crude oil it was carrying, and kept it. So what have Iran done then? Well, they've obtained a judicial order to seize this very same vessel, having just left Iraq, carrying crude oil from there bound for Turkey. The ship now renamed St. Nicholas, and they've taken it back to Iranian ports. And I have to say, I do love how Iranian media are choosing to tell this story. The Fars news agency, the news outlet for the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, so bear that in mind, have described capturing the St. Nicholas like this. The Iranian Navy said in a statement that the Suez Rajan oil tanker had stolen the oil cargo belonging to Tehran under the guidance of the United States and transferred it to an American port. Back in April 2023, Washington illegally seized a vessel carrying Tehran's oil under the guise of a sanctions enforcement operation. In late August, the US Navy unloaded the tanker's stolen Iranian oil worth around $56 million off the Texas port. This was not the first time, though, that Washington resorted to such foolhardy adventurism, stealing oil and blatantly bragging about it. The quintessential US banditry and thuggery have been on display on many occasions in recent years. Iranian officials strongly condemned the US act of piracy, warning that Tehran won't let the illegal action remain unpunished. They cautioned Washington that the era of hit and run has come to an end, stressing that Tehran will not stand idly by in relation to any violation of the nation's rights. They stressed acts of trespassing on tankers carrying Iranian oil are clear example of piracy, reminding the parties that have plans to confiscate Iran's oil to review the history of Tehran's actions in similar cases. The Navy statement added that the tanker, renamed St. Nicholas, was seized on Thursday with a judicial order and in retaliation for the theft of Iran's oil by the US. Sounds like we can expect Iran to keep the oil then. The US called this theft. Last year Iran called what the US did theft. It's tit for tat. It's the same old story over oil. The Iranian ambassador to Venezuela was quoted by another Iranian media outlet, IRNA, the Islamic Republic News Agency, which is the government-controlled news outlet of Iran. So again, more caveats for that. But the ambassador, Hojat Soltani, and let's face it, Venezuela has oil issues with the US going back years as well, as many of us full well know. Well, he said in a tweet, in May 2023, the Yankees stole a shipment of Iranian oil with a North American tanker. Yesterday, the Iranian Navy proceeded to seize the same tanker. This means strategic patience. We have maintained patience, yet we never forget. Does smack of a revenge attack when it's put like that, really, doesn't it? It also makes a bit of a mockery of maritime law, though. If the US can nick oil under the guise of a military operation, and Iran can do likewise the following year to the same ship, so no sense of irony lost, with an Iranian court order permitting them to do so. But doesn't this just reinforce how big a problem the West are making for themselves in the Middle East, already unpopular as they have been, and especially since the nations of the Middle East are so much better able to retaliate? The Gulf of Oman, as this incident happened in, runs along the eastern side of the Arabian Peninsula, as well as the Red Sea, which forms the western side of the Arabian Peninsula, and it's a whole area we know is rich in oil and all necessary to global trade, certainly in keeping the overhead costs down associated with global trade. Are basically going to become no-go zones now, and for what? Again, the reasoning all these countries can right now point to for how they interact with Western shipping, particularly now that the US and the UK is the situation in Israel and Gaza, and the fact the West are still even now siding with Israel and allowing this genocide to go on, even to the point they've now attacked the Iran-backed Houthis in Yemen, which has just made the situation for Western trade, Western vessels, even worse. Would this have happened if a ceasefire had been instigated, this theft of this tanker, if the US weren't constantly vetoing it? Now, at the point we're waiting for the World Court to issue a ruling Israel have already said they're going to ignore, with other countries now joining them in that view. Stupid isn't the word. At what point does backing Israel end up no longer worth it? At what point will that come? Tens of thousands of people being killed in Gaza already hasn't done it. Pledging to ignore the rule of law even, so economic sanctions by the Middle East against the West, is it now then, is it? Can we expect more of that? And frankly, what can we do about it if the Middle East do go down that road? You start a firefight around oil tankers? Well, we know what'll happen there, don't we? They have the West, if you'll excuse the pun, over a barrel here, don't they? Well, the US response, consisting mainly of whinging about all of this, seems to bear that out. The US Navy's 5th Fleet Commander, Vice Admiral Brad Cooper, has said, Iran's actions are contrary to international law and threaten maritime security and stability. Nah, sorry, Brad. They had a court order. Now, you might not recognise the court that issued that order, but they do. And this is the rub, isn't it? The Pentagon has weighed in as well. They really have had their noses put out of joint in the US, haven't they? Their spokesman said, when asked what America was going to do about this and would they make such actions public, I'm not going to telegraph, forecast or speculate on any potential future operations, and I think that the statement from multiple nations when it comes to the fact there will be consequences should the Houthi attacks not stop speak for itself. And they also said, we call on Iran to release the tanker and the crew immediately. Clearly this activity is contrary to international law. It's another example of Iranian malign activity threatening security and stability in the region. Consequences and bringing up the Houthis. Does that imply the US will take their ire over this tanker out on the Houthis again then? None of this is frankly diffusing the situation, of course. The US and Iran cannot stand each other. That's hardly news. They've been at each other's throats for decades. They need little excuse to have a go at each other. However, the US cannot cry foul and point to international maritime law to suit itself when it has itself been stealing oil, and Iran in this case has stolen some back, and both are alleging the law was on their side to do it. Well, international maritime law has to be adhered to by everyone and enforced in the same way, and clearly that is not the case, otherwise we wouldn't be here, would we? This is, if anything, a separate issue from Israel, but the question has to be asked, would Iran have bothered about this ship, oil-rich a nation as they nonetheless are, if not for what was going on in Israel right now? Who can say? But the obvious starting point to calming things down is a ceasefire in Gaza. The US should think more about that, and less about its own embarrassment about Iran getting one over on them. Sadly, this is far from the only escalation involving Iran and the US, as they've issued warnings to both the US and the UK regarding tying themselves to Netanyahu's destiny, whatever that might mean. And, well, if you really want to know, you should watch this video here next, and I'll hopefully see you on the next vid. Cheers, folks.